This is Marshall Jones at Winthrop University, and we're continuing to talk about web design. There's another video that exists that talks about graphics and images from a technical standpoint. We want to move to talking about them from a more interpretive standpoint, and then also begin to talk about text, navigation, and look and feel on your websites as well. The field of learning design and technology has an area of study which is known as visual literacy. This definition is a good one to get started with. Our ability to interpret the meaning of an image is what is meant by visual literacy. Now, oftentimes our ability to interpret those are culturally based. There are things that may mean something visually in one culture but have a different meaning in another culture. So it can very definitely be culturally based, but what we're trying to do, particularly as we look at images on websites, is to make good decisions about the images that we're using. There are some general tips that I would point out to you, and those are available here. Some of those tips are based on the technical. The larger an image is, the longer it takes to load. Now, this is not a particularly big deal for people who are using high-speed internet connections, but if you've got learners who are using slower internet connections or internet connections that are congested, like those in schools, then it's something you definitely want to think about. Another part of this is using images that help us to help the learner make sense of content, so that we're using images that are relevant to the content and not there simply as window dressing or as decorations. So as we begin looking and thinking about images, I want you to think about these three things. I want you to think about who your audience is. I want you to think about what the tone of your website is. And I want you to look carefully at the images that you select so that you're making the best choices for your website. To make an extreme analogy here, or point perhaps, if we were designing a website for a mortuary service, what would be the more appropriate graphic? Now, you may have heard the phrase pushing up daisies. The image on the right very definitely is pushing up daisies, and I sort of like this image a lot. It's a little macabre, but it would be an inappropriate image to use on a site for a mortuary service. Why? Quite simply because it would be making fun of or making light of somebody's grief. The image on the left would be a more serene image that would provide a more appropriate tone for such a website. Because oftentimes the images that we use can get interpreted by different people in different ways. And let me give you some examples of this. This is a piece of Microsoft clip art that I got when I searched for boss. Now, as you look at this image, I can't get your reactions to it, so I will tell you when I do this in a face-to-face classroom or presentation, some of the responses that I get. And that is that the person on the right is oftentimes defined as being the boss, and the person on the left is thought of as being the not the boss. Now, the reasons that this can be interpreted, and I accept that you may interpret it differently, but the woman is shown as being in a typical clerical type of role. The furniture that she's sitting on is a task chair. It's not an executive chair. She is shown as being associated with papers and filing cabinets, which are oftentimes seen as clerical types of roles, and they're oftentimes the roles that women are stereotyped as being a part of. The man is wearing a dark suit and a tie, and is standing up and talking to this other person. In this image, he is defined as being the boss. Now, There are also some subtext to this images which you may or may not pick up on. I have heard people say that the image is a little creepy because it looks like workplace flirtation, inappropriate interactions at a workplace. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I want you to be careful about searching for images under different terms, because those terms are defined by somebody and by their worldview. So oftentimes, if you're looking particularly at clip art, then clip art has a historical, cultural, and gender bias. And by that I mean that oftentimes, if you're looking for bosses, they're almost always going to be white men. There was a time when it was hard to find images of ethnically diverse people that weren't stereotypical. So oftentimes Japanese people were going to be in traditional Japanese dress, like kimonos and or ceremonial dress, and not sort of the day-to-day dress that people would be wearing. It's not nearly as bad as it once was, but I want you to be careful about that as you're looking for images. I also find this image interesting. Again, it's a search for boss. It's a little different. The woman is still seen as being in a sort of a clerical support role as defined by the things that she's doing. But look very carefully. In this image, these are the same people. They just recolored the skin tones. I find that sort of interesting. So images have meaning, and the type of image you use can set the tone for your learning environment. If you think for a moment about banks, if you had a background for a web page for a bank, you wouldn't want to use image on the left or the one on the right of the daisies. Apparently I've got a daisy fascination going on here. The image on the left of the bricks represents more stability and security than a whimsical wallpaper. However, if you were doing a website for students in early grades, the image on the right could be perfectly appropriate. So you just want to be careful about these things as you choose the images for your websites. I also want to spend a little time talking to you about text and the text fonts that you might choose on your websites. There are two different types of fonts. There is a serif and a sans serif font. A serif font, here's an exaggeration of one, has these little feet on them. You can see the little feet on the F, and in the sans serif font, there are no feet on that. Serif is French. It's translated in loosely as curly stuff, and sans serif would mean without curly stuff. Typically speaking, on web pages, sans serif fonts are easier to read. Now, because resolution, and the reason for that is that sometimes the feet on the sans serif fonts can interfere with other parts of a web page. They can interfere with pieces of an image, with pieces of a background. However, it does not matter as much as it once did because our image, or the resolution of our monitors is so much better. But if you're going to be working, particularly with young learners, I would recommend that you go with the sans serif font. Young learners oftentimes find it more difficult to distinguish letters if they've got non-standard feet associated with them. There is a font war, and that font war exists between the person who designs a website and the person who is using the website. It is possible for somebody, for reasons of visual acuity, to set the default font on their computer so that when they're looking at web pages, it always appears at a particular size and a particular font. If somebody does that, then it doesn't matter what font you use, the font they choose is going to display. And that means it can impact the layout of your website for the user. I recommend staying with traditional types of fonts and traditional font sizes. If you're using an editor like Weebly or Wix, they're going to have fonts and font sizes that are built into the templates that you've chosen. And I recommend staying with those pretty much within reason, so that because it's going to allow the website to manage optimization for mobile devices. So when you look at it on a phone or a tablet, if you're leaving their template defaults, it's going to be able to handle those better moving from device to device. I would encourage you to not use fully justified text, meaning text that has a hard left and a hard right image. You really would be better off with ragged text. So you got a left justified image, and then your right margin is more jagged. Centered is fine for titles. You don't want to use centered text in paragraphs. It's hard to read centered text in paragraphs. I would also recommend that you stay away from all caps for multiple lines of text. One is because it's seen as shouting on the internet, but also because it's harder to read all caps than it is to read sentence case text. Oftentimes, editors will default to the all caps for titles, and that's just fine. The last thing I want to talk to you about in terms of graphics and text is choose carefully your color combinations. You can see on this image, on this slide, which ones work and which ones do not. Red and blue together are a really bad idea. I forget if it's the hue or the saturation that are so close together, but it actually makes it look like the text is moving on the screen. I am always stunned when I see people put yellow text on a white background or white text on a yellow background, because you really can't see it at all. What you need is high contrast between your background and your foreground. Yellow and green work pretty well together as complementary colors, and black and white are always a classic choice. But the other thing I want you to notice that happened here is, in this slide, how I use these boxes for balance, so that the slide itself has some visual balance to it as well. And that's something you want to think of as you're building your websites, is how your slides can, or how your web pages can have a nice balance between text and graphics. This is Marshall Jones at Winthrop University, and we've been talking about website design for learning environments.